Chariot, Britain's secret weapon, beneath the waves. The night of June 26, 1944, is moonless and bitterly cold off the coast of occupied Norway. In the darkness, a modified submarine surfaces briefly in a narrow fjord near Trodheim. Two figures in specially designed suits descend into the black water, their breathing apparatus hissing softly against the silence. What they carry beneath them is extraordinary. A sleek, torpedo-shaped craft measuring just over 7 meters in length, piloted by a single operator. Within hours, this mechanical marvel will carry them directly into enemy territory, moving beneath enemy warships, unseeable and unreachable. They are riding the Chariot, and they are about to attempt something no military force in the world has successfully accomplished: the precise, controlled infiltration of a heavily defended harbor using only underwater propulsion and human skill. What most of the world does not yet know is that the British have created a weapon so far ahead of its time that it will not be effectively duplicated by other nations for years to come. This is the story of how British ingenuity solved a problem that seemed, for all practical purposes, impossible to solve. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The threat was not merely military invasion, but strangulation through the slow destruction of the merchant fleet. German warships, particularly the heavy cruisers and battleships, operated from Norwegian ports with virtual impunity. The Royal Navy possessed superior surface firepower, yet these enemy vessels could be reinforced, repaired, and resupplied without ever venturing into open water where the British could engage them decisively. Attempts to strike these targets using conventional bombers had proven costly and largely ineffective. The German Navy's heavy ships remained anchored in deep Norwegian fjords, geographical features that made traditional aerial bombing perilously difficult and conventional naval attack nearly impossible. Something entirely new was required. The problem was not merely one of military strategy but of physics and engineering. The fjords of Norway are long, narrow water passages often lined with steep cliff faces and heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and torpedo nets. Any ship attempting an approach would be detected at considerable distance and subjected to overwhelming defensive fire. The British came to a startling realization. What if an attack could be delivered by men in submarines so small and so quiet that they might move beneath the notice of conventional defenses altogether? What if an infiltrator could be taken directly beneath an enemy vessel and released to attach a charge to its hull? Historical precedent existed, certainly. As far back as the American Civil War, a submarine had famously sunk a Union ship using a torpedo attached to a long spar. But that was crude, unreliable, and dependent upon proximity to an enemy vessel already engaged in combat. What the British were contemplating was something far more ambitious: the controlled delivery of a one-man or two-man submersible to a target location, operated with precision, and then withdrawn. The existing technology offered no solution whatsoever. Standard submarines were far too large, far too loud, and far too conspicuous. A new approach was needed, one that could only emerge from genuine innovation born of desperation. In the summer of 1941, a small group of officers at the Admiralty began discussing a revolutionary concept. What if they could create a submersible device small enough to be transported by a larger submarine, yet maneuverable enough to navigate complex coastal terrain? The idea was developed and refined by a dedicated team of designers working within the Combined Operations Headquarters. The engineer most closely associated with the concept was Lieutenant Godfrey Imhoff, who worked with a small design team based in Portsmouth. The resulting creation was officially designated the Slow Torpedo or Chariot, though the latter name eventually prevailed. The device itself was nothing short of ingenious in its simplicity. The Chariot measured 7.4 meters in length and weighed approximately 1.5 tons when fully loaded. Its electric motor powered a single propeller, which could drive the craft through water at speeds of approximately 4 knots, or roughly 7 kilometers per hour. This seemingly glacial pace was, in fact, intentional. The lower the speed, the less noise generated, and the quieter the device, the less likelihood of detection. A single operator sat astride the Chariot, much like riding a torpedo, experiencing the water around him directly with no protective hull or cabin. The operator breathed through a self-contained air supply system, an early version of what would become known as scuba apparatus. The Chariot carried a warhead weighing 300 pounds, or approximately 136 kilograms, contained in a cradle that could be detached and left beneath a target vessel. The manufacturing process was classified at the time, and details remain scattered across various archives, but the basic construction employed non-magnetic materials to the greatest extent possible, minimizing the likelihood of setting off anti-submarine detection equipment. Production numbers were never large. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 60 Chariots were built throughout the war, though exact figures remain classified even today. The craft were manufactured at a small facility on the south coast, assembled with meticulous care by skilled engineers working under conditions of great secrecy. Each unit required hundreds of hours of labor and represented a substantial investment of precious wartime resources. What made the Chariot truly revolutionary was not any single feature, but the integration of multiple innovations into a coherent system. The self-contained breathing apparatus allowed sustained underwater operation without tethering to a surface vessel. The battery-powered electric motor eliminated the vibration and noise associated with conventional fuel engines. The minimal hull configuration meant minimal resistance to movement through water, allowing the device to operate efficiently at extremely low speeds. Together, these features created something that had never before existed. A weapons system capable of delivering a human operator with destructive cargo directly into an enemy harbor, moving quietly and nearly invisibly beneath the surface. Operational deployment of the Chariot began in 1942, though results were often frustrating and sometimes tragic. The first major operation occurred on October 26, 1942, when 2 Chariots were transported to Gibraltar aboard a vessel named the Firth of Clyde. The mission was to attack the Italian battleship Littorio, which had been causing significant damage to Allied convoys in the Mediterranean. The British submersible HMS Safari carried the 2 Chariots into the harbor at Algeciras, releasing them approximately 3 kilometers from their target. What happened next remains frustratingly unclear. The 2 operators, Lieutenant W.R. D. Malby and Sergeant G. Vicentini, successfully navigated the approach to the Italian vessel. Accounts suggest they successfully attached the warhead beneath the battleship's hull, but the detonation mechanism failed to function as intended. The device was subsequently discovered and removed by Italian naval personnel. Within days, both operators were captured. The mission was officially categorized as a failure, yet it had proven one essential point. The Chariot could, in fact, navigate to its target successfully. The problem was not the concept, but the refinement of technical detail. Subsequent operations were better coordinated. On March 22, 1944, 2 Chariots were deployed against German shipping in the Nord Stream, a waterway connecting Oslo to other ports. Under conditions of extreme cold and driven by operators displaying remarkable courage, the craft successfully reached their targets and attached warheads. The German minesweeper M412 was severely damaged by the resulting explosion, and a German U-boat was attacked, though with less decisive results. In the fjords of Norway, where British operations were concentrated in the latter years of the war, Chariot attacks contributed to an atmosphere of extreme caution amongst the German Navy. The psychological effect was pronounced. German commanders never knew where or when a Chariot might appear. Defensive measures were improvised, including boom defenses and anti-diver nets, all of which consumed resources and personnel that might have been deployed elsewhere. The intelligence threat posed by the Chariot sometimes exceeded the material damage it inflicted. If you are finding this fascinating, I would genuinely appreciate a quick subscribe to the channel. It genuinely does help more than you might imagine, and it means these stories continue to be told. The Chariot stood essentially alone among the world's military powers in its sophistication and integration of design principles. The Germans, despite their considerable engineering capabilities, never developed an equivalent weapon. German efforts in the realm of submersible warfare focused instead on larger devices like the Biber, a true miniature submarine featuring a protective hull and operated by a crew of 2. The Biber was more comfortable for its operators but considerably larger, louder, and more conspicuous than the Chariot. German designers also experimented with manned torpedoes, most notably the Nager and the Marder. But these were crude by comparison to the British innovation. They lacked sophisticated navigation systems and relied upon simpler control mechanisms. The Italians, with whom the Germans had shared some technical information, developed the maiale, or pig, a successful human torpedo system, but it similarly lacked the refinement of the Chariot. In terms of technical sophistication and engineering elegance, the British design was distinctly superior. The Americans, despite possessing considerable industrial resources, focused their efforts in different directions. Whilst they eventually developed their own submersible devices, they came considerably later to the concept and produced far fewer units. The American Swimmer Delivery Vehicle, or SDV, was not operational until well after the conclusion of the war in Europe. What the Americans ultimately appreciated, however, was the conceptual foundation that the Chariot represented. Throughout the 1950s and beyond, the principles inherent in the Chariot's design, quiet, efficient electrical propulsion, self-contained breathing apparatus, minimal hydrodynamic profile, became the foundation for modern special forces insertion systems. The British had, quite literally, invented the template for underwater infiltration that would be refined and improved throughout the decades to come. The actual material impact of the Chariot in the Second World War remains difficult to quantify with precision. The tonnage of enemy shipping destroyed or damaged by the device cannot be separated from the tonnage damaged by other weapons in concurrent operations. Historical records frequently contradict one another, and German Navy records were dispersed or destroyed in the final months of the war. Conservative estimates suggest that Chariot attacks directly resulted in the sinking or significant damage of approximately 4 to 6 major vessels, though some analysts argue the figure may be somewhat higher. What is beyond dispute is the psychological and strategic impact. The mere knowledge that German commanders possessed of the Chariot's existence caused them to implement extensive and costly defensive measures in Norwegian ports. These measures tied down personnel and resources that might have been deployed in combat operations elsewhere. German servicemen stationed in Scandinavian ports were required to undertake extensive diving watch duties, monitoring for infiltrators. The confidence that previously existed amongst German naval officers regarding the security of their anchorages was substantially eroded. This psychological effect cannot be measured in tonnage of shipping or monetary cost, yet its strategic significance should not be dismissed. The Chariot represented something new in warfare, a weapon that was less valuable for the material destruction it inflicted and more valuable for the defensive anxiety it provoked. German strategic planning in the later years of the war increasingly centered upon the assumption that any major warship anchored in a Norwegian fjord faced the possibility of a Chariot attack. This assumption, though not always validated by actual results, nonetheless influenced important operational decisions. The Chariot's influence extended far beyond the Second World War. The fundamental principles that guided the Chariot's design, electrical propulsion, minimal hull volume, operator-centric control systems, and self-contained breathing apparatus became the theoretical foundation for underwater infiltration systems throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Modern Special Forces divers operating SDVs, SEALs riding diver propulsion vehicles, or operatives employing contemporary underwater insertion systems are, in many respects, utilizing tools that represent direct descendants of the Chariot concept. The British Navy, recognizing the potential of these systems, continued developing Chariot variants and successors throughout the Cold War. The Royal Navy experimented extensively with Chariot-derived systems during the 1950s and beyond, though many of these projects remained classified and few entered service in significant numbers. What the Chariot had accomplished was to prove that underwater infiltration was not merely possible, but could be conducted with a reasonable degree of reliability and tactical effectiveness. No previous weapon system had demonstrated this principle so decisively. The innovation was sufficiently significant that it attracted the attention of every major power that possessed naval ambitions. Today, the principles that the Chariot embodied remain central to Special Forces operations worldwide. It is perhaps fitting that the Chariot, born from Britain's desperate circumstances in 1941, has largely faded from public consciousness. Those who piloted these craft and those who designed them accepted considerable personal risk in service of an idea that must have seemed frankly impossible when first conceived. They proved that a single engineer's sketch in a Portsmouth office, refined through countless iterations, tested in dark waters off hostile coasts, and piloted by men of extraordinary courage, could fundamentally alter the parameters of what was militarily possible. When Lieutenant Imhoff and his team first began discussing the concept in 1941, no nation in the world possessed a weapon like the Chariot. By the time the war ended in 1945, the British had not merely built such a weapon but had demonstrated its operational viability with unquestionable clarity. The German Navy, with all its battleships and all its resources, could not prevent a single man on a torpedo-shaped craft from infiltrating its most heavily defended harbors. That realization was not merely a tactical shock, but a strategic one. It suggested that future warfare would not belong to those with the largest guns or the most tonnage of armored steel, but to those with the greatest ingenuity, the most innovative thinking, and the willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions about what was possible. The Chariot represented all of these things in mechanical form. Whether viewed through the lens of military history or engineering history, the Chariot stands as one of the 20th century's truly significant innovations, a weapon that was, quite literally, decades ahead of its time. Standing in a museum today, if one is fortunate enough to locate a surviving example, the Chariot appears almost comically small and absurdly primitive by modern standards. Yet to understand what this device represents, not merely as a weapon, but as proof that one nation, pressed to the wall by circumstance, could produce an idea so revolutionary that it would reshape the parameters of warfare itself, is to understand something profound about human capability when confronted with genuine necessity,